So thank you very much for those greetings, Jose and Julie and Gwen. And I think as you heard from Gwen, there is, not just a couple of people, but really an institute-wide support for this kind of work. And it's always wonderful to hear. And every time, Gwen tells it, it gets more complex and there are more parts involved. And it's really exciting. So to think that we have an entire NIH institute behind us is just wonderful. Before introducing Gaji, I just want to say vis-a-vis the partnerships in environmental public health, please do go on the web, on the NIHS website, and subscribe to the PEPH newsletter. It's a wonderful source of opportunities for funding, of news, of the grantees, of new ideas coming across the transom, and a way to be connected to a lot of these things we're talking about. In terms of evaluation, which Gwen also mentioned, we do have an online Google-based evaluation form, and we'd love you to fill it out. It's both helpful to us, I think, but also maybe helpful to you, because we're asking you both some closed questions and some open-ended questions, and maybe, as you look at that set of questions, it'll help you go forward in doing your own kind of work, and maybe even consider an article for the New Solutions issue. I also want to remind you that we have not just the work groups that are listed in the program, but we have opportunities for lunch sessions, and we do have a list outside. There's at least one that Jonathan London will be working on with one of his colleagues, and we hope that if you have other topical areas that you want to meet with people over the next couple of days, just write something down outside at the registration desk, and we've got enough rooms and places for people to meet. So in introducing Gaji Cook, I should say that when Julie and I had our opening conference for the biomonitoring ethics project, Gaji was one of the speakers. And we loved so much hearing her that we said the real problem with that is that she only had as much time as the other speakers. And we wanted to hear more because it was so wonderful. So we decided finally to have this conference, which would be a great vehicle for Gaji as a keynote speaker, as well as the other agenda items that we had. But we think that she's got some incredibly important things to say about this intersection of social science and environmental health. She's an Akwesasne Mohawk who is an elder Aboriginal midwife and a lifelong advocate for women's health and reproductive rights and environmental justice. Gaji is a research associate at the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of Natural History, and for the past 10 years has served as director of the First Environment Collaborative at Running Strong for American Indian Youth. Gaji was a fellow at the University of California, San Francisco's Program in Reproductive Health and the Environment. She's been a member of the Indigenous Peoples Working Group of the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and also a member of the CDC's National Tribal Environmental Health Think Tank. There, and in all of her work, Gaji emphasizes the significance of Indigenous women's health across the life cycle based on the knowledge that woman is the first environment, first relationship, first experience, and first medicine of a new life. In her own community, Gaji is a member of the leadership core of the Ganangwe Council that guides young women and men in transformative, culturally based rites of passage activities. And currently, she's program director at the Novo Foundation, where she'll help develop and lead new work on Indigenous communities starting in the fall. So we're very pleased to have Gaji Cook here as our keynote speaker to kick off this conference.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, everybody, and special greetings to my good friends in the audience who I will enjoy speaking to later. I don't know if my PowerPoint was able to be loaded up since I was so late in submitting it. I asked Dr. Hoover at Brown University how to focus for the needs of this conference and the agendas that's been set forward in these days. And so she asked me to talk about how I got myself involved in research initially, the contamination in my community, experiences working with academia, and where the work that was stimulated by a birth in my community where a mother asked, is it safe to breastfeed? I was a member of the Akwesasne Notes Communications project of our Longhouse Council of Chiefs, and traveled throughout North America, Indian country, with the White Roots of Peace Communications Group, which was my alternative education after bailing out of Skidmore College and Dartmouth College, realizing that the elements of our survival are in the knowledge and in the practice of our indigenous epistemologies. And so I have here an image. We know how we know what we know sets the parameters of legitimate knowledge and is culturally defined. How do I advance these slides?
Hit the space bar.
Oh, this one?
Hit the space bar.
Oh, just on the...
Yeah, just on the...
Okay, thanks. Here we have Mohawk artist John Sawat Thomas's birth story of creation, of Iroquois cosmology, how we got to be in this hemisphere of North America on the back of the great turtle, an ancient narrative in which the pregnant sky woman, Ojijiso, her name means mature flowers, fell through a hole in the floor of the sky world that was made when a great celestial tree that illuminated that world withered and was uprooted. And this sounds like a familiar metaphor for what we're talking about in environmental health. We see here the now famous sky woman landed on turtle's back, and hers is the creation story that belongs to a specific ecosystem on the earth, which is the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem, of which my community is a part. Ojijiso's reproductive powers personify symbols, structures, and systems of meaning from which contemporary Six Nations women can reconstruct an understanding of how our own society works and what its principles are. Our creation stories count as evidence for us as Indigenous people. Through storytelling and the power of metaphor, we understand how to be human beings in relation to everything else in creation. We learn that cycles of creation are continuous, and this painting captures the metaphors that drove our community understanding of the PCB dump site, the profundity of our sense of place, and beyond to the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem, of which we are an area of concern as designated by the International Joint Commission. In their 2011 paper, Chronic Disease and Risk Factors Among American Indian Alaska Native Women of Reproductive Age, Amparo and al. Found that 3 out of every 5 American Indian Alaska Native women aged 18 to 44 years have 3 or more chronic health conditions or risk factors. Multiple stressors contribute to this vulnerability, including lack of access to culturally safe health care, coupled with exposures to industrial chemicals, violence, and complex intergenerational trauma from failed federal policies such as the theft of our children from our communities to be put into religious-based boarding schools, which that epic only ended in the early 1970s. And today there are more Native children in foster care than ever were in the boarding schools. So poverty and food security are part of this web of interrelated downward spirals that amplify adverse environmental reproductive health effects at the individual, community, and collective levels. So again, we see John Thomas creates for us an image entitled Onunkwasua, honoring the medicine plant people, the knowledge of and relationship to that are held closely and administered by grandmothers. The importance of maintaining maternal ethnobotanical knowledge for child welfare in a resource-poor Bolivian context was identified from biomarkers of child growth, nutrition, and immune function by McDade et al. 2007. Indeed, the emerging literatures of epigenetics and now the exosome reinforces the knowledge that if you want to know the health of a woman, you need to know the health of her maternal grandmother. And we are matrilineal, matrifocal, and matriarchal, but only in consciousness, since there never has been a documented matriarchy in human experience. Human health, language, and culture begins in the prenatal environment. Therefore, health systems revision and revitalization of culture and language must focus on puberty, preconception, and prenatal critical windows of development. Our human capacity for pair bonding and social engagement begins in the intrauterine environment. It's at this most critical window that the health, the embodied wealth of present and coming generations is determined. My Mohawk elders instructed that the unborn see through their mother's eyes and hear through their mother's ears, especially in the dream days just before their births in the last trimester. They learn from their mother's thoughts, experiences, and emotions. She is the first teacher. And at the child's birth, the event further changed the family, community. Speeches were given on behalf of the baby's birth, such as, "Thank you for coming to our village. We hope you will stay with us, teach us, and help us." And so we know that embodiment is the idea that social, economic, cultural, and political forces are expressed in bodies and are mediated by biological processes. So that when we first heard in 1983 of the registration of the General Motors Superfund site on the national priority list for PCB contamination, our Akwesasne Notes offices were laying directly adjacent to the GM dump site, where we had established our Akwesasne Freedom School, a school in Mohawk immersion. And so our way of knowing is embedded in our language. And so the difference is illustrated by a few words that I'll share with you. In English, the word for midwife comes from Anglo-Saxon roots, meaning with woman, which is beautiful thought. But in Mohawk, one of the words for midwife is yewelogwas, that gives a broader swath of concept about what it is that's going on when a baby is being developed and brought into this world. It means she's pulling the baby out of the water, out of the earth, or a dark, wet place. And so in terms of the PCB site and what to do about it, when our own people were going into the site, because at that moment we were in a political action against New York State in terms of our rights. The Akwesasne Freedom School was in fact like an enclosed village, that our ability to move out of that village was constrained by this political tension with New York State. And so 43 families were in that encampment for 3 years, and we would eat rabbits and fish from what was called later by wildlife pathologist Ward Stone Contaminant Cove. And we used to take our kids down to the banks of the St. Lawrence River and cover ourselves with mud and play dirt people as a form of entertainment for the children. And when we began to understand that this is a major national priorities list Superfund site, we realized that something had to be done. So already Leonard Crook at Cornell University had been brought up in the early 70s to deal with the spewing of fluoride ash out of the Reynolds Metals aluminum processing plants, of which there were 3 developed in the post-World War II economic boom along the St. Lawrence River. When you look at why those factories were situated there, it has to do with the relationship of New York State and the Mohawk Nation of Akwesasne. Their intention was to deepen the capacity of the St. Lawrence Seaway and to take the Racket Point area where this contamination is of highest concern and make it an inland port for the shipping lanes of the river. And so when I hear the messages that have already been given in this meeting, I'm really heartened by where science and the social sciences, where anthropology and social science and the technical science are beginning to intersect and partner up. One of the earliest things I ever heard in my longhouse was that the problem is that the visitors have a way of understanding knowledge by looking through a microscope but not seeing the rest of everything else. And so apparently those barriers have been broken and the vision is greater and bigger and more towards where we need to be. It's important to understand that North American Indigenous are not a racial or ethnic minority, but are one of the three sovereignties in the United States, the federal, state, and tribal governments. And so that our traditional cultural property is protected in two federal laws, as well as a whole body of case law, Supreme Court decisions, treaty rights, and has significance for the work that's being done to recover our community from this historic moment of the post-World War II economic boom and the development of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so as we began to consider how do we approach our thinking about what to do in our community, we marshaled the forces of many scientific bodies. I literally dug into the literature after the mother who birthed at home asked me, is it safe to breastfeed? A huge epidemiological study was funded by Health and Welfare Canada, I forget his name, but he was a very popular, globally known epidemiologist that was funded $1.2 million, which at that time seemed like an enormous amount of money. And I thought, they'll figure it out. Mount Sinai came up and did a PCB study with Mohawk people, focusing especially on the fishermen. When those results came out, they were this high, and they sat on someone's desk at Mount Sinai for 3 or more years. When we finally marshaled our forces and insisted they come back and report to the community. By the time they did, we had already approached different scientists who had published papers on PCB contamination in mother's milk. The Jacobson study in Michigan is a classic example. I called, I forget his name, in North Carolina, who was looking at PCBs in mother's milk also at that time. And the problem was there was no analytical methodology in order to look at the 200 or more arrangements of the PCB compounds and the differing effects on different systems in the body. So the science was really young and really new. But the most impactful for our community in understanding what we were facing was Ward Stone, a wildlife pathologist for New York State, whose papers I'd read where he described collecting turtles laid dead on the shores of the St. Lawrence River, and in analyzing their brain and liver tissue, found enormous volumes of PCBs in their brain and liver tissues, hundreds of thousands of parts per million of these contaminants. And so you saw from the first image the significance of the turtle for our understanding about what counts as knowledge. And so rather than using the language of parts per million and parts per billion and these esoteric, privileged languages of academia, for Ward Stone to come to our community, and it took going to his lab and telling him what's going on and giving him the cultural context of the Mohawk people. He just had a way, probably because of his understanding of wildlife. We still organize ourselves through the matrilineal and through 3 clan systems in our longhouse at Akwesasne: wolf, turtle, and bear. I'm Wolf Clan. One of my tendencies is to go into the wild, into the wilderness of science, and dig a hole and see what's in there and drag it back to my people and say, look at what I found. And so that's literally been my own methodology, is going out into your world, into your language and to reading enough of your knowledge to be able to translate and interpret that back to my own people and tell my cousins, my family, because if you want to get anything done in Indian country, you have to go to your cousins, you have to go to your grandmother, you have to stimulate the kinship network. And if we have anything that the typical American people don't, is we still have our extended kinship system intact and in place, and it's still functioning. And I'm so happy to be at a time where we can use our social and cultural intelligence to deal with the reality of environmental contamination of our lands, of the fact that the Office of Violence Against Women understands that 1 out of 3 Native women have experienced trauma in their lives. We have incredibly violent communities, incredibly amounts of racism. As a board member of Running Strong for American Indian Youth, I visit a little school in the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation in the middle of nowhere, Takini School. Takini means survivor. These are the grandchildren of the Wounded Knee Massacre. And they only have 4 days of school, and they don't have a math teacher because they can't afford one. And when these children go off to tournaments, basketball tournaments, the white kids in the local towns call them prairie niggers. In this day and age, that kind of racism still exists because it's a mechanism for which the non-native people in South Dakota can marginalize the legal realities of the Lakota nations, of their ownership of the Black Hills. And so there are these political elements that are strongly at play in Indian country that add to this devastation of losing the quality of our environment and our access to the natural environment. And it has a great impact on our language systems, on our understanding of our bodies. And so here are a few of the ways that we experience our bodies through the cosmological, mythological concepts that I discussed earlier. And so from that we know we need to restore sacred knowledge, ceremony, symbol systems, and narratives. That the territorial piece, when you talk about creation stories and mythology, you're talking about the accumulated dreams and visions of a people over time, and each generation has to reconstruct from those symbol elements what it means to be a human being, what it means to be inside of a family structure and a community that resides in one place for a long time. 10,000 years the Great Lakes Basin has existed the way it currently looks. And in fact, the place Sky Woman landed is Manitoulin Island. And when I went there, I talked to Danny Musqua, who's a fluent Ojibwe speaker, and asked him, I know you call this place Manitoulin Island, which means where the spirit beings meet. Is there another name for this place? And he thought, and he said, you're right, it's this. And he said the word in Ojibwe, and I said, well, what does that mean? He said, it means the woman's nest. And so I don't know about all of you ladies, but when I became of age, my mother described that part of our bodies as the woman's nest. And so this analogy and metaphor of reproduction and environment are deeply entrained and intertwined in our indigenous thinking. And so very young in my longhouse, doing the women's dance and participating in the practice in our culture, I began to realize how important the women's power in terms of midwifery was. And so Jose, the speaker earlier, when you talked about the high prematurity rate and the connection to endocrine disrupting chemicals, I would add, in terms of what Gail said earlier about the exosphere, is that what it was? Exosome is there in the U.S. Main body, North America. African American women have the highest prematurity rates in the country. And I have a colleague in Florida who runs a birthing center that we help fund through the Groundswell Foundation. And in her model of care, which she calls the JJ Way, Jenny Josephs is her name, she takes women and doesn't charge them for her care. And so they come for her care, and she receives them and gives them care in the midwifery model, and they have had no premature births with the midwifery model of care. So I recommend to you that you pay more attention, pull your head up from the microscope and the reductionist approach to these issues and broaden it to the social sphere. I know that I like to talk about mitochondrial DNA because it's the brilliance of why we formed clans. The Jesuit missionaries, in their reports back to the Pope in the 1600s, observed in their thinking that the reason everything was matrilineal over here is because the women didn't know who the fathers were. And in fact, we had a very scientific approach to organizing our social structures, and it had to do with the matrilineal line. And so in Puerto Rico, there has been an analysis of the genome to find that over 50% of Puerto Ricanos are indigenous people. And so there's a whole revolution going on in the Caribbean about the marginalization of the indigenous identity there, that they got fed the same lies in there that we did in North America, that, oh, the Indians are all dead. You just have to watch John Wayne on TV. And so the social pieces, that which matters, is in the knowledge of our practices. And so I know that some of these slides you already are well informed in terms of the transgenerational impacts of industrial chemicals on reproduction. And so I want to move on to some images that better illustrate the message that I want to share. It's interesting for me as a midwife in studying human embryogenesis that the first 8 weeks after fertilization, the first organ that forms in the embryo after conception is the neurotube. The job of the neurotube is then to grow a heart. The minute the heart achieves the critical number of cells, it produces neurons, nerve cells that are the basic building block of the nervous system that constitute the brain structures in the spinal column. Nerve cells aren't mobile. The heart produces the cells that make up our brain. The heart then produces a brain to do the job the heart can't do. So the first thing we do as humans is to make a heart, and then to make a brain that works in service to the heart. Thus the heart is raised from the status of a pump to that of a commonly accepted integrator of endocrine function and regulation. And that regulation is part of the reciprocal relationship between the mother and the baby. And so here we have an image that I got from the walls of Toyabe Clinic in Bishop, California, back in the 1980s, giving them a seminar on why they need to restore midwifery care. I don't believe that any community, anywhere in human experience, is going to be healthy until midwifery model of care is restored to communities and to women. And so that's been my basic fundamental message across Indian country that was supported as I worked under a grant from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in 1994 to 1998, and then another 4 years under Dr. Mary Hoover, who was a student at Cornell University while I was there working on the breast milk study. I was able to use part of that community work. The program was Communications for Environmental Health, connecting health professionals, community members, and research scientists. And our research partners were David Carpenter, Ed Fitzgerald, and others at the New York State Department of Health. And it is the funding mechanism under which the School of Public Health was established. At the same time, we established the first freestanding birthing center in Ontario at the Six Nations community. Under a law in Ontario, because remember, my community on the St. Lawrence River was trisected after the War of 1812 to take the knees out from the Mohawk people. That's in southwestern Quebec, southeastern Ontario, and northern New York State along the U.S.-Canadian border. So I've delivered babies and done work in policy in all three jurisdictions. And as a result of that NIEHS grant, part of that communication is because our people move across the Mohawk communities, of which there are about 6 through Ontario, Quebec, and New York State. And so we were able to establish under the 1992 Regulated Health Professions Act and the Midwifery Act that exempted any Aboriginal midwives and healers from any regulation by the government. And so as a member of the College of Midwives of Ontario, as a previously practicing Aboriginal midwife, of which there was only one left in all of Ontario, I told my colleagues, I'm not going to become registered, I'm going to use our rights, because if we don't use our rights, we lose our rights. And we established the Six Nations Birthing Center under the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. And we recently accomplished a new policy piece in Ontario at the Ministry of Health to fund midwives who are working, who have not been registered at the College of Midwives, but are working under the sovereignty of our own communities, where the buck stops and the governance of midwifery belongs to our communities and not to an insurance company or a board of directors at a hospital that are no relatives of ours. And so sovereignty is a key outcome of research processes for Native American peoples, because the time is now, we're in a critical moment where a whole generation has been put at risk. And there's not a lot of us. We're less than 1% of the whole population. But when you look at a global picture, Indigenous people are 4% of the world's population, living on 20% of the land, and monitoring 60% of the world's natural resources. And so we need to pay attention to what's going on in the Indigenous world. What does it mean to be Indigenous? Of the genes, grounded in a place, the specific environment within a specific ecosystem where your language emerges from. We don't do evangelism. You can't be a Mohawk in Hopi country because there's no maple trees there. It's our whole spiritual base is entrained to an ecosystem. And so this is our way of being human. We want to restore that to our people because there are really three things that affect the gene environment, individual person environment interaction. It's toxics, trauma, and thought. And that thought is embedded in languages. And so those of you who are here in this meeting, your consciousness is entrained to the language of your specialties. And so my whole purpose for being here is to encourage you, just as the earlier presenters have said, that it's holistic, it's broader than just the specific aims of your individual research projects. And so we need to keep talking together. This is such an exciting moment. Here are some of the outcomes from the PCB led MIREX, DDT, DDE research. And of the cohorts that have been looked at, beginning with Mohawk mothers who breastfeed, my breast milk was one of the highest body burdens of PCBs. Strangely enough, the DDE wasn't there, but MIREX and the other agricultural pesticides were. I gave birth to 5 children, including a set of twins. And my daughter and one of my sons are on Synthroid for the rest of their life. And so when you look at these outcomes, And even though I raised my children away in Ithaca so we could work at Cornell University, my children still fell into this picture of a whole generation of Mohawk youth who have been impacted by the body burdens from their mother's milk. And so Akwesasne Mohawk adolescents who had been breastfed had significantly higher PCB levels than those who had not been breastfed, a difference that persists into their young adulthood. And this is why the natural development from the recovery of midwifery practice in Iroquois communities necessarily tells us that prenatal care is too late, that we need to begin at puberty. And isn't it interesting, at the same time that I'm thinking that in the community level, then the Breast Cancer Fund came out with an inch-thick volume by Sandra Steingraber about endocrine disruption globally and precocious puberty. So these children need to be put under layers of protection. And so as they enter their young adulthood, that their average PCB levels are between 90th and 95th percentiles of the U.S. reference sample, and according to the CDC. And so breastfeeding is the foundation of our subsistence economy. It's a neurological, evolutionary, biocultural aspect of this woman as the first environment thought, episteme. And so the significance of bringing cultural factors and to biomarkers together as an emerging emphasis in social epidemiology that brings together biology, the sciences, because biology exploded with molecular biology. Now everything has a biological model and metaphor attached. So these are very powerful in our community, because one of our nurse practitioners in the clinic, my sister cousin Chief Beverly Cook, took the creation story when she came to participate in the opening of our Six Nations Birthing Center, the proposal for which I grounded in our creation story to the Ministry of Health, and began to creatively design an understanding for our youth of and there's an image of Bev here working in our OC at the bottom. This is Beverly. And she likened the ovulation to the fall of Sky Woman. So she took these images and made them real. Because what kids get in school with the language of ovulation and of reproduction are, again, languages like Mittelschmerz. Some German guy discovered that when a woman ovulates, there is a slippery fluid that's released through the birth canal. And it's called also Spinbarkeit. It's a marker for ovulation, and it's a powerful moment. But in our language, it means ojiskwa. It's slippery. And so to use our own language in talking to our young girls is a key to building strength for this generation, and to improve the self-esteem that was damaged by the boarding school experience in generations, where grandma was taught to be ashamed, that being a woman is a bad thing, less than. And so we've had to conquer this reality of women not knowing their own powers. These are some of the outcomes from an Indian Health Service funded series of 18 focus groups that I moderated in 6 tribes of the United South and Eastern Tribe region of the Indian Health Service. This was a bunch of money dumped by Congress on the tribes across the United States to set up tribal epidemiology centers with the goal of trying to lessen alcohol-exposed pregnancies in Indian country. And when you talk to epidemiologists about American Indian women, the main message they'll give you is that Native American girls initiate smoking cigarettes very young and at higher incidence and prevalence than any other group in the U.S. And the same concern for alcohol-exposed pregnancies. But when you go to those communities and you begin to see the adverse childhood experiences scores of our youth and our women, our grandparents, our fathers, because of historic trauma, it's an overwhelming tsunami of grief, of loss and trauma that is embodied in the generations. And so any research that is conducted in the tribes has to begin with the analysis of the impact of historic trauma and its embodiment in our psyches, our bodies, our stories, and our histories. And so already we have bundled up those social, cultural, and scientific realities and are wending our way through. And so you can easily read the key empowerment of women through reproductive health and childbearing, build on community social support, increase capacity for tribal members to develop community-led and culture-based initiatives, increase the knowledge of community members and public health staff in communications concepts regarding age-appropriate human sexuality, and providing trustworthy cultural resources to help guide the integration of conscientious cultural knowledge. And so this is the landscape of our coming generations, of the seeds that are being carried in our young adults are already marked by these social, cultural, and environmental health issues. And so in response, my collaborative, First Environment Collaborative at Running Strong for American Youth, with funding from Ford Foundation, brought together both clinics, Gunawatsaleo on the Canadian side and the St. Regis Mohawk Health Services on the U.S. side. For the first time, they trained together in a centering pregnancy model of group care. For 75 years, we've been delivering prenatal care in clinics with no evidence base that any of that approach works. But it's the best thing we know, so we do it. And universities need to change the way they prepare practitioners, physicians and nurses and midwives to fit some of the communications issues that I've heard you talk about this morning and in other contexts in relation to environmental health. I love this definition at the People's Environmental Health Perspectives at NIEHS, the degree to which individuals have the capacity to obtain, process, and understand health information. Here are two Mohawk pregnant women in the revised prenatal care at St. Regis Mohawk Health Services. They took their own weights, they took their own blood pressures, and they're keeping their own charts. My daughter-in-law was in centering pregnancy, and she was on the steering committee, and she says, "Mom, there's a difference when you're taking your own weight and there's nobody leaning over your shoulder to mess with the little weight, because you own that data. You own it. They don't own it. They're not writing it in your chart. You are, and there's a different psychological effect. It sounds subtle, but it's empowerment." And so here's a centering pregnancy group at St. Regis Mohawk Health Services. It's extremely difficult to change people's behavior, huh? You know, you're a person, I'm a person. It's hard to change our behavior, isn't it? This is a wonderful line that I read in the Harvard Business Review of May of this month. Instead, change the environment in which people make decisions. So centering pregnancy and centeringhealthcare.org, and I don't have any investments in any of what I'm talking about, other than my own generations, is so brilliant. I think that I advise all of you to start reading the Harvard Business Review, because there are management practices in there and high echelon ways of looking at communications and management that will inform environmental health and social sciences. And I think this is brilliant. Change the environment in which people make decisions. So here's the mission statement for the Emergent empowerment of Native women through the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives. Step by step, we're climbing to the top. And step by step, you get to the policymakers, just as Phil was talking about being received at the White House and being received at the governor's mansion. We need to be doing more of that. So we promote excellence in reproductive health care for Inuit, First Nations, and Métis women, who altogether are bundled as Aboriginal because it's English legal heritage. We advocate for the restoration of midwifery education, the provision of midwifery services, choice of birthplace, home, birthing center, or hospital. When we started the College of Midwives in Ontario, in order to be registered, a midwife had to maintain her confidence and competence to deliver babies both in the hospital and at home. 40 births a year, 20 had to be at home, 20 had to be in the hospital. In the US, because of the militarization of this society, everything follows what the military does. High authority, high control. You see it in the news every night. And we resist this kind of control, again, made by people who are not relatives of ours. And so that's our agenda in my community, is to regain our power, is to maintain our sovereignty. And here is the latest victory, that once the government saw that we can do this, we can take on the responsibility of governing our own lives at the tribal level. I stepped forward and told my colleague midwifery practices who were competing of one pot of money in Toronto to step back. The college is the one who registers and licenses your practice. If you really want to follow principles of social justice, let the Aboriginal midwifery framework be the funded proposal in Toronto. And when a local politician came to our community birth search to strategically plan the development of the birthing center, he was a young politician who told me off in the side conversation, my family left Virginia and went up a boat into the mouth of the St. Lawrence estuary, up the St. Lawrence River, and got stuck in the ice just like Jacques Cartier did in the 1500s. And it was the native people who overwintered us, and in the spring helped us get on our way, and we got off our boat in what's now Toronto as pilgrims, and thanks to the native people, we made it that far up the St. Lawrence River. So I reminded the professional bodies, the hospitals, which would receive any transfers of care from this birthing center, that if it weren't for the native people, the Aboriginal people of the St. Lawrence River Valley, you never would have made it to Toronto. You never would have made it up that river. And so this is the aspect that is so important. So this is a translation from the Mohawk. How am I doing on time? Huh? Soon, okay. We will reawaken the strength of all female life to bring forward the love and medicine from the Mother Earth we dance upon, because we remember the coming faces. So these are our value systems explicated into our everyday world. And so here's another Mohawk word, honaste. Corn is an English word for any grain that they grew in Europe, but our own word for corn, or for maize, is honaste. And when you do an etymological regression of the word, you end up with the idea that there are layers of protection around a seed, a sacred seed that comes from a spirit that involves the male and the female element. And this is from which we draw the title of our revised rites of passage, the Ohalogo rites of passage, under the husk. And so this same idea, whether it's pregnancy or coming of age, there's a principle from our creation story called down bending, where you cover the mother and the adolescent with corn husks, and you sequester them in a spiritual way and encircle them with down from the cattail, so that you can decipher if there's been any intrusion into their spiritual space. And so these are the mechanisms, and here are our young initiate women standing by the Sky Woman's Garden. Again, everything in our creation story is about a garden, and I would say all Indigenous creation stories have to do with the garden. And so this led us to where we are now in my tribe. We're looking at buying 461 acres in our land claim area and wondering, how are we going to talk our people into investing into another plot of land in which we can do a Department of Agriculture currently being led by my brother Tom Cook. And so that's our solution to the PCB contamination, is to find soils far away from the air drifting that continues to this day. PCBs are coming off the remediation site that we just drew down another $20 million from the PCB remediation pot of money in the U.S. Because as deep as they've dug, they're still finding pools and pools of PCBs that are now volatilizing into the atmosphere. This is something you all should know about. There's a program on reproductive health and the environment at the University of California at San Francisco, led by Tracy Woodruff, who, if you haven't ever heard of Tracy, get on the internet and Google her. You can't work in environmental health and not know about her. And so I use this with health professionals to encourage them to submit an application to work on a piece of policy at the Environmental Protection Agency. And so this is my team, CPF, working on a chlorpyrifos re-registration policy in 2011. Collaborators Protecting the Future. You have Al who is a public health professional from the state of Maine, Katie Huffling, who's a certified nurse midwife, myself, an Aboriginal midwife. There's Carol Kwiatkowski, who is now the executive director of the Endocrine Disruptor Exchange, who followed Theo Colburn, author of Great Lakes, Great Legacy. Carol is now heading up Theo's organization, and Pamela Miller of Alaska Communities Against Toxics. I was so happy to be able to work with them and learn from them. And so the trajectory that we're on now as the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives is that the Canadian provinces are realizing they haven't done any integration of environmental health into the health professions. And so we did a presentation in Ottawa this past February that now there's a big meeting coming up, the 21st International Federation of Gynecologists and Obstetricians, being held in October in Vancouver. A preliminary conference will bring the obstetricians and the different health professional organizations, including the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives, to strategize a global policy to work on moving some of these chemicals out of the marketplace. And so I was really happy to hear your comments, Phil, and NIEHS. I really want a copy of your PowerPoint because some of those elements need to be verbalized at this meeting coming up in October. And to talk about, with the obstetricians, about the need for understanding the bigger picture of environmental health, at the same time being challenged with the clinical reality of dealing with individuals and report back for all kinds of data, let alone contamination of your body data. And there's a wonderful resource at this website. If you just go to YouTube and click on Little Things Matter, it's a wonderful example of a communications message that can be situated in any prenatal clinic or watched by any mother that talks about endocrine disruption and chemical contamination. This is me at the Ohilogo Rites of Passage several years ago, looking at our youth. The right are the women, the left are the young men. These are our future mothers, grandmothers. These are the ones we're intervening. And so it was a gift of the great mystery that I was able to enter into a new space at the foundation world level to be able to create an impactful project that would empower Indigenous girls and women inside of their Indigenous communities program. And in the world of health professions, there's a new buzzword called structural competency. And structural competency is the trained ability to discern how a host of issues defined clinically as symptoms, attitudes, or diseases, depression, hypertension, obesity, smoking, medication, noncompliance, trauma, psychosis, also represent the downstream implications of a number of decisions about such matters as healthcare, food delivery systems, zoning laws, urban and rural infrastructures, medicalization, and even about the very definitions of illness and health. Simply put, structural competency teaches that people's rates of sickness and death are as connected to their zip code as they are to their genetic code. And so our presentation had to do with historical frames of oppression, present-day socio-political barriers and challenges to health, the main challenge being the education of health professionals so that they can be competent in delivering group health care, because the expert certified professional becomes the facilitator, and the participant mothers or patients or clients become the experts. They share the phenomenology of their experiences, whatever that experience is identified in the clinical space as being, whether it's cardiovascular disease, pregnancy, aging, diabetes. Centering healthcare can be applied to all of these different contexts. I have a deep feeling in my own practice that 5% of what we hear, we remember, and 95% goes in one ear and out the other. And so most important is what a speaker makes you feel, and not, you already know so much. There's not too much more I can say to you, but to encourage you to keep circling up. Let's follow that model of centering and circle up our knowledge. We have to use all of our knowledge. I was told that by a Mayan daykeeper who came to my community 30 years ago, and I use his calendar days in my life, my midwifery practice, my family, and today is one Imosh, a day of the men's intelligence. And so here we are with the technical combining with the social. And so to add the spiritual, I want to ask you to indulge me as I sing a song that I'm going to be singing in a sweat lodge very soon, keeping in mind everything that's being done here for 2 days. So I want to ask you to put your papers down, get comfortable in the seats where you are, fix that wedgie and push that hair out of your face, and don't be distracted by anything that goes flittering by in the environment. If the fire alarm goes off, we can get out and go. But I would like to engage your consciousness, your own spirit, your own fireplace, with a song that briefly means in the Lakota language, you're addressing Tunkashila, the great mystery. We're standing here. We're standing strong. Mother Earth, we're standing upon you, and we're sending a voice to the earth and to the great mystery. And so if you could indulge me for a minute, close your eyes, don't focus on me. I want you to Spend time with yourself, with your own spirit, so that these things that you're hearing over these 2 days, that you can deeply integrate into your consciousness, into your work, and into your own health and well-being. Ochimaka nawashishinaya wo akwalawa yuhawa ueloheo weheaya 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 Ochimaka nawashishinaya wo alala yuhawa ueloheo weheaya 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 Mitakuye oyase to nyawa sagoya tizo danun uchimaka. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and for listening. To.
I don't know how to say anything after that, Goji. That was beautiful. We try to integrate social science and environmental health, and you integrate so many more things for us. So thank you for giving us such a wonderful start to this time. Thank you so much. We're fortunately running behind because of having such wonderful words and music and spirit. So let's just take this really quick bathroom and snack grabbing break. We'll be late. We'll probably shorten lunch, and we can always go a little bit later at the end of the day.